Good morning, everyone. Good morning, students. Good morning, colleagues. This morning, we are going to look at quantitative methods, and as the slide says, it is an introduction. So it is a general overview of when we choose quantitative methods, what do we need to keep in mind? It's a little roadmap, and it's an introduction. It is really just thinking about what quantitative means and what makes it unique as a method, whether I'm at the proposal phase or whether I'm already somewhere in my journey towards ending a report or a dissertation or a thesis. What is this quantitative method? What must I keep in mind? So if we look at the goals of today's workshop, I'm going to discuss the general features of a quantitative approach, and I'm going to focus on what makes it unique, what makes it different from the other approaches. We're going to deal with concepts, variables, and their measurement, which is something that we need to keep in mind at the start of our journey and all the way through until we write up our findings. Then we're going to look at the issues of reliability and validity, at data collection strategies that are suitable to the quantitative approach. We're going to quickly look at sampling strategies, then at quantitative data analysis. Note, we're not going to teach statistics at this stage. It is what can I do in this approach and what can I consider? And then the practical implications of this approach. When I start this journey, it's going to lead me in a particular direction. And I think that's something that I always keep in mind, that at the start, when we've got an interesting research problem that we want to go and research and write up, there are, in methodology, a million different roads I can take. But if I choose the one, I must stay true to it. I can't cross over into a different lane without causing a big collision. So this is the goal of these two workshops. If you choose a particular path, a quantitative or a qualitative or a mixed method, you must stay on that path all the way through. So before we start, I want you to remember the following general ideas. Quantitative methods follow a very given pattern. Sometimes that makes it a little bit more easier than the more fluid, flexible, open systems such as qualitative or participatory methods, where your method changes a little bit in the field. You start pursuing a different line of inquiry. With quantitative, it is a very given path, a given pattern of steps that you will take to get to the end of your journey. That sometimes makes it easier because we know what that pattern is and we can put it down beforehand and we can just stick to that recipe without making too many changes along the way. Remember that again that I say this is a general overview. And as such, it's not specific to a specific discipline. I realize that you are studying in a particular discipline and that sometimes the methods that you will use are very particular to your scientific career or in the discipline that you work with. So this is a general one. And because it's general, I'm giving you broad strokes and some exaggerations. And what I also want you to keep in mind, and we'll revisit this when we do the qualitative orientation, is that this divide between quantitative and qualitative is often exaggerated, especially to make the differences clear. And it's also a function of many introductory textbooks on methodology that this quantitative, qualitative is seen as a divide of two worlds that live apart and can never meet. But eventually you will see in your own research that often we use a little bit of each of these orientations to get to the answers that we want. So often when we discuss them as these two paradigms, we exaggerate their differences. Please see the quantitative and qualitative methods as endpoints in a continuum, with varying degrees of overlap between. Now, when I choose qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, evaluative research, feminist research, it doesn't matter. You must understand the road that you picked and why you picked that road to get your answers on your research question. But the most important thing is that you must use all the tools that this particular paradigm gives to you to tell a compelling story. In the end, whether you are writing your proposal, a research report at the honors level, a dissertation, or a thesis, it is the story about this research problem. And make that story compelling, draw your audience in, and most of all, make it your story, your voice. The way that you employ these tools is unique to your story, and the important thing is to convince. We always say that in academia, we use evidence-based writing. You would have seen this a lot in any kind of assessment you've ever done for UNISA, that your lecturer would say, where is the proof of your argument? Give an example. Where is the reference? Are there a different school of thought than the one that you are presenting? All of that means that in academia, we try and convince. We write in a convincing way, so we use these tools and the statistics and the data to convince others of our findings. Getting to grip with the concepts. Now, very many introductory textbooks are very guilty at being very loose and fast with important concepts. And I want to point out the differences between them. When we talk about methodology, the ology part of that word means a philosophy, a school of thought. So methodology is not just about how am I going to collect the data, how am I going to analyze the data. Methodology is a philosophical stance, a worldview, if you like, a path that you've chosen that underlines and informs a particular style of research. So when we talk about a quantitative orientation or a quantitative methodology, it includes not only the way that we collect the data, the way that we analyze the data, but all these underlying characteristics of this orientation that we're going to talk about today. Methods is just a method. When I bake a cake, it would list to me the ingredients I need to have and the methods to put all of this together. So methods are always about how I collect or generate the data and how I analyze the data. Now you would also see that many textbooks talks about data collection and sometimes they talk about data generation. Now that's also a very important difference. If I collect something, it means it exists already, not so. If I walk in a field, I can collect wildflowers, right? It exists already. Generating data means that I'm putting things into this world that didn't exist before my research intervention. So that could be in terms of an experiment that I'm doing, or I'm asking people questions about something that I haven't thought of before. For example, I can go into my workplace and ask people about their job satisfaction. Now I'm asking them about a concept or an idea that they might not have thought about before. So that's the difference between collecting and generating data. And as we contrast quantitative and qualitative, the difference between these concepts will become even clearer to you. And then there's data analysis. So methods are those two things. Methodology is the philosophy that I employ to use these two methods. Then we get the research design. And to me, the very best definition of a research design is still the one by the Faust, 2001. The function of a research design is to ensure that the evidence obtained, in other words, my data, enables us to answer the initial question as unambiguously as possible. Can you see my warning about a convincing story? This is what my research design does. Now, there are common patterns in research design, but you must understand that the research design for your study will be unique to your study. The reason being that research design is built around your research question, that the initial question in that quote, to answer the initial question, that's your research question. For example, my research question is, what is the job satisfaction of staff members in the Department of Development Studies at UNISA? It's a very specific question, and I built my research design around that question uniquely. So a research design is a strategy that justifies the logic. Logic is the methodology, the structure and the principles of the methodology and the methods, and explains how these relate to the research question. The biggest favor you can do yourself, whether you're writing an article, whether you're writing your proposal, whether you're busy with your dissertation or your thesis, is to always have your research question in mind. Write it out, print it out in the biggest font that you can, and put it down where you write, because everything needs to go back to that research question, and that is the path of my journey, the research question. Now, you've already had workshops on the research proposal structure. I just wanted to show you where the methodology usually fits into something like that. You would have a title, a problem statement, research objectives, the scope or delimitation of your study, the limitations of your study. Now, the limitations are often related to the methodology that you chose. Remember, I said you choose a path. When you've got your research problem, your problem statement, there are millions of roads that you can take. You took one called Quantitative, so that would place certain limitations on your study. Your literature review, you often talk about the importance of our study, the motivation for it, or the rationale for our study. Why is the study being done? And here is your research methodology. Then you would probably deal with ethical considerations, your time framework, your chapter layouts, and your list of sources. So this is roughly where it fits into this whole process. What is my chosen approach, and why does this methodology fit my topic? When I look at my research design, I can decide whether my study is descriptive. In other words, I describe this problem. Let's say my problem is cyberbullying. I'm describing what it is, how many people are experiencing cyberbullying, has it increased, has it decreased, what are its characteristics? That would be descriptive. And can you see I can be descriptive in quantitative, because I can say how many people are affected by it, right? Which other variables describe the propensity of people to become cyberbullies or the victims of cyberbullying. I can be explanatory. That is where I start explaining what causes this phenomenon. If I'm talking about job satisfaction, which factors make certain people satisfied with their job and others dissatisfied? It can be exploratory, that is where not a lot is known about my study. It can be emancipatory, that is often in the kind of approaches where I say, I want to go and look at the size and dimensions of a particular problem that causes certain groups of people to be at the lower spectrum of a power differential, what makes certain people marginalized, what makes them suffer certain social ills more. And my whole goal with my research is so that I can inspire change, that I can make very specific policy recommendations or recommendations for practice to change that marginalization. That's an emancipatory approach. Or it can be critical, where I start critiquing it is because of perhaps the forces of neoliberalism that we've got a particular situation, the forces of colonialism. That is a critical approach. Now, these are different approaches, and I can use them in quantitative or in qualitative. Important to know that they are not exclusive, and sometimes I can have a study that have more than one of these approaches in them. But I've always got to go back and say, what kind of a study do I have there? And most studies always would have a descriptive element to it, because we're trying to say, what is this thing that we are researching? Then I can go and decide that I want qualitative, quantitative, mixed methods, experimental. I want to do a meta-analysis or a documentary or a desktop review, and so on. Then I need to look at my time dimension, cross-sectional or longitudinal. I'll get back to this differential about cross-sectional and longitudinal later. But basically, if I look at a cross-section, I'm asking, what is the situation now in April 2021? So it's a snapshot, a cross-section of what the world is like at this moment in time. Longitudinal is where I follow up a group over time. Let's say I want to look at children from birth to 10, or I want to look at students who've started their honors studies in this year, and 10 years from now, where are they? That is where I deal with the time dimension in a longer way. A prospective or a retrospective study is again how I deal with the time dimension. Prospective, where I want to go and predict what will happen. A typical case would be, I want to go and predict for which party people would vote for in a by-election. I want to go and predict whether people would go for COVID-19 vaccinations or not. Retrospective is backward looking. So my study can also be about looking back at what were the decisions for you to start studying with UNISA in the honors this year? What was the reason why somebody took up a particular career, or what happened to have this outcome? So these are all how I deal with time in my study. And here is a very important point. Number 4. Is there a match between my design and my objectives? This is very important, and this would make your proposal or your dissertation or your article be successful and convincing, or the otherwise. In other words, what did I set out to do? If I wanted to describe, if I wanted to explain, if I wanted to be emancipatory, those were my objectives. Did my design enable me to do all of those things? So in the end, this is whether your study was successful or not, which is why I say, do yourself a favor and be very sure what your central problem statement is that guides your whole journey, because that will make you think about, what do my design add for me to achieve my objectives? What is unique to a quantitative research design? Quantification is obviously all about numbers, statistics, to say how many people are affected by a particular issue. How many people are food insecure? How many people are facing unemployment? Things like that. It is collecting data so that I can have statistics. It is a very systematic way of researching. It doesn't have that flexibility where I change in the field. It is often standardized, and it's got a fairly fixed pattern. I can put down my recipe today, I can follow it, and then in the end write it up. Typical quantitative research designs would include experimental research. Some of you might do this, not very popular in the social sciences. Maybe there are a few experiments and a few field experiments. Something can be experimental, for example, in the way that the e-tutor teaches the students in their group can be an experimental design, for example. Then we get the cross-sectional ones. You know what I said about cross-sectional designs. It is what is happening now with a number of cases in one point of time. It doesn't mean in a single day. It's not a census on this night. It means that generally for this fieldwork period, what was happening, how many people were experiencing certain things, what were the variables and the characteristics. A very popular cross-sectional design is, of course, surveys. Nowadays, online surveys or electronic surveys are used a lot, or I can use existing statistics. Longitudinal designs, you know what I said about those, can be your panel or your cohort studies. And then another one that's very popular, especially at the honors level, because you're trying to do a very small scale study, is the case study research. Now, case studies are very interesting because case studies can be quantitative completely, they can be qualitative, or they can be mixed methods. Typical research objectives in quantification. These are keywords that you can use when you write your research objectives. Usually, one would have a primary objective that is very close to your problem statement. And from that primary research objective, you then start writing secondary objectives. And when I get a proposal, I go and check this. If my student says to me, I want to do a survey, a quantitative survey, I go and check in the objectives whether the objectives use the keywords that typically tells me this is quantification. It would be a keyword such as, I wish to measure job satisfaction, I wish to measure burnout. That is looking at the current status of something, at variations over time. In other words, how many people were unemployed 10 years ago versus now. I want to go and measure differences between groups. So I look for the keyword measure in the research objectives. I want to go and look at the keyword evaluate. If we monitor and evaluate something, it often has a quantification target. How many students were reached by this particular intervention now and then later? Typical quantification. If I want to go and predict, if I want to say how many people are likely to vote for a particular party in the next election, that's prediction, quantification. If I use the keyword test, I want to test the relationship between certain variables, whether more women employees have less job satisfaction than male employees or whatever, that kind of testing. So use these keywords when you've got a quantification or a quantitative orientation in your research objectives. Your keywords in your research objectives shows to whomever is reading your research that you understand that the road to quantification would imply that you do these tasks. I said before that the quantitative research journey has got a very particular pattern, and that we can set that pattern beforehand and we follow that recipe. It usually starts with us reading up a little bit of theory so that we understand what our research problem is. Then we can state hypotheses. Some disciplines are stricter about setting the hypotheses than others. Others would say just write research assumptions instead of very strict hypotheses. It's very specific to the discipline that you work in. Then you would go and write your research design. You would think about how you measure your concepts, how you take abstract concepts and turn them into measurable variables. And I'll get back to this important point. Then you would probably go and select a certain site or a certain population. You would select the units sampling within that site or that population. Then you'll go to instrumentation, that is setting up your instrument with which you're going to test. Important difference here. When we talk in quantitative orientation, our instrumentation usually is called a questionnaire or a observation schedule. When we talk instrumentation in qualitative, we talk interview guide and not questionnaire. Questionnaires are structured instruments. And the idea, remember, with quantitative is to have a very specific pattern and to stick to that pattern each time you observe. Therefore, a questionnaire is often set in time, whereas an interview schedule that's flexible and open and qualitative can change as I carry on in my field research. Then I would go and look at data collection based on that instrument, data analysis. I will analyze the data to have particular findings and a write-up. And then it should go back to inspiring my theory. But it's a very specific step. Here's another way to depict it. Theory, hypothesis, research design, devise measures of my concepts, in other words, turn my concepts into variables, select a research site, select subjects. Subjects, we can often talk about participants or respondents in quantitative, but very specifically research participants in qualitative. Then I go and administer my instrument. I process my data. I analyze my data. I have findings and conclusions, and I write up my findings. Very clear steps in a quantitative research process. Typical quantitative research designs are deductive. Now you would read the words inductive and deductive often in methodology books. And inductive just means that I start from an assumption and then I start collecting data to investigate my problem, and then I analyze the data. So what is the typical steps in deductive reasoning? I select a topic that is unknown, unexplained or new, right? We don't go. You can, in quantitative designs, go and repeat somebody's study. A very famous study that was done somewhere else 10 years ago. You want to go and repeat it now and see if you find the same results. But often we want to do something that's new and exciting and unexplained. Then we go and investigate current theories surrounding the problem or issues. We find the key concepts and we operationalize these as variables. We're going to do a bit of this today. What is the key concepts and what are the variables? Now, what's the difference between these two things? Concepts are abstract ideas. If I say to you the idea job satisfaction or the idea of burnout, that is still abstract. You will have a definition of it in your head. I will have a definition in my head of what this thing is. But how do I go and measure it? How do I observe it in my sample? When the moment I do that, it means I operationalize this abstract concept as a measurable variable that can have different levels in each one of the people that I'm going to apply my instrument to. Then you can go and hypothesize an explanation for the problem based on a particular relationship amongst your independent variables, your predictor variables, and your outcome, your result, or the dependent variable. Independent variables are things that causes the outcome or the dependent variable. For example, my pot plant is dying. The reason being that I didn't give it enough water and light. So water and light were the predictors for plant health, my dependent variable, my outcome. Then I go and select a sample that would be representative, and there are very specific rules for representation in quantitative that is different from qualitative. I devise structured data generation tools, structured being the key word here. Now, it doesn't mean that I say that your questionnaire is not allowed to have open-ended questions in it, by all means. But many of your questions in a questionnaire, a structured instrument used in quantitative, would need to be fixed answer questions that lead people into asking very specific questions, because my goal is to go and say how many people feel a certain way about this issue. And then we can have scales and so on. Then you would collect and process your data and verify your findings. And you make your final conclusions. You present your findings in an appropriate form for your audience. And we will look at these forms for quantitative later today. Conceptualization, definitions, and key variables. Right at the start of your proposal, and I think this is where most of us are. We're looking at a proposal either for an article, a new research report, or a thesis or a dissertation. We've got to think of what are the key concepts in my topic and how am I going to operationalize them into variables. In a quantitative design, we need to define all our key variables and note their level of measurement. This is very important, and I'm going to go into levels of measurement shortly. Concepts, as I say, are abstract. I can't go and see job satisfaction with the naked eye, right? It's an abstract concept. But if I can surely go and measure it in terms of a variables where I have indicators of that concept. If I have the following things present, people will have a certain level of job satisfaction. For example, what is the content of their work? What is the nature of their work? What is their pay or their wages or their compensation? Are there any promotion possibilities for this person? Does this person feel that there's recognition of their effort? What are the working conditions, the working hours, and the benefits? Can you see all of these are indicators, things that I can go and measure, that together would make up a particular score or status in job satisfaction. Operational definitions of indicators. I want you to try your own example. Let's say we're dealing with a very abstract concept of burnout. Many students in last year said to me, I'm experiencing burnout. Because I do so much of my work online. Everybody in my family is studying online. I experience burnout in my roles as an adult right now. What does it mean? Abstractly, we can say that burnout means emotional, physical, and mental exhaustion caused by excessive and prolonged stress. Can you see that's still an abstract concept? And to make it into a measurable variable, I would need to have indicators for each one of these. What would indicate emotional exhaustion? What would indicate physical exhaustion? Things such as inability to sleep. What would indicate mental exhaustion? What would indicate excessive and prolonged stress? Can you see how we move between the abstract of the concept and the very concrete of making that concept in all its possible definitions measurable for me, observable for me in my population, so that I can go and measure it and explain it. Here is the typical differences between qualitative and quantitative designs. We're going to do qualitative next week, so maybe it's not so important to look at this side of our graph. Let's look at these. Quantitative, for its sampling, is typically a probability-based sample. Not always, but mostly it's usually bigger samples when I do quantitative. Probability means that I can say what is the probability of each element or each person that I sampled to be in my sample or not in my sample. When I do quantitative research, I want to generalize. I want to say for this particular population, generally this is the trend. It is an objective kind of measurement. We call that normathetic. It means it's law-like. If I in my sample find this to be true, it will be true. I can generalize to my whole population. It tends to want to answer the questions, how many people are affected by this particular thing, when are they affected, where are they affected. I want to predict and control. And a quantitative method seeks facts or causes. What caused this particular social phenomenon? What are the facts surrounding it? If we can just quickly in this one look at how it contrasts with qualitative, you see that qualitative, instead of asking how many and when, says what, why, how, and understanding behavior from the actor's own frame of reference. Quantitative different. I say that something such as burnout exists and I'm going to measure it. If I was more qualitative, I would say maybe the notion of burnout does not exist. I'm going to find out if people have a particular experience of it. Okay, quantitative is hypothesis testing. I verify things. I start predicting from my literature review. I think that the following things will cause a particular outcome, and I'm going to look in my particular study site and in my sample whether this holds true for this population as well. We've spoken about the deduction already. It is very particularistic. In other words, I want to say for this particular sample, this is what I found, and I can generalize it to my population. In a quantitative orientation, your data must be efficient. What does that mean? Often when I go in and apply my instrument, I want to get it done in the shortest possible time for myself and for my respondents. So I'm going to apply my instrument or my questionnaire, and it needs to be very efficient. I need to get the answers that I'm seeking for very efficiently and in the least time. Because I do that, because I standardize a lot, as I said, you can have some open-ended questions, but mostly you want closed option questions. I might miss contextual detail, but this is not the goal of quantitative. Quantitative says, how can I get the most data most efficiently? And it's often an outsider perspective because you sit in your study and you decide all the steps beforehand. You've got a fairly standardized questionnaire that you're going to apply. You have fairly standardized ideas of the variables you're going to measure. It is an outsider perspective. It is not how the people themselves feel. It's often, how do I go and measure this thing as a pre-existing thing in this population? It's referred to as the ethic view. My design is decided in advance. In advance, what is my recipe? Because it's going to be standardized all the way through. And I can write it down. And it assumes a stable reality. You have to. If you want to standardize your questionnaire across many observational moments, we need to assume that nothing in that situation is going to drastically change while I'm measuring this thing. The population is not going to disappear all of a sudden. Or if I'm observing in a very structured way, classroom interaction, the classroom is not going to disappear. I assume that it would be stable during that time that I do that data gathering. There are various tools to use and instruments to be employed, but it's a very controlled measurement. Here are examples of quantitative research designs. Look at the first one, very easy. It says, the problem that this researcher was grappling with was factors influencing the early adoption of green electricity by a group of residential users. For example, solar panel geysers. So this is all this researcher wanted to do, is what would lead certain people to adopt this green electricity long before the rest of their neighbors. That was their research problems. They decided to do a telephone survey, and it was conducted amongst a random sample, a probability sample of adopters, in other words, people who already have green electricity, and non-adopters. So I would just find out the reasons why these people adopted and why the others didn't adopt of green electricity. Variables for early adoptions were developed from literature and tested in a structured questionnaire. Here we see all the typical elements of a quantitative structure or orientation that's decided upon in the study of the researcher long before the fieldwork started and then gets applied. Here's an example that's not so typical of quantitative. Let's look at that one. It says poverty and inequality in international development discourses. That doesn't at the first glance look like a very typical quantitative design, but let's see what they've done. They say international development agencies pay less attention to inequalities than to global poverty. So what this researcher did was a documentary analysis to see how inequality and poverty are framed in agencies' policy publications. Documents or their sources included the World Bank's World Development Reports, the United Nations Development Programme, Human Development Reports, and a set of white papers by bilateral donor agencies. Doesn't at first glance at this looks like a desktop literature review, but it's not the way that this researcher applied it. This researcher said, okay, what I'm going to do is desktop research, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all these documents, download them, And then I'm going to start with a coding framework in which I say, okay, how many times were the words inequality used as opposed to poverty? And what was seen as the variables that underlie inequality, what was seen as the variables that underlie poverty, which countries were listed, and so on. So they made a very quantitative analysis of the discourse in these documents. So can you see, I can be quantitative even with documentary analysis. So students often think that if I say quantitative, I always need to just go survey, or I need to say I'm going to analyze statistics from Stats SA, or I will do an experiment. You can always do qualitative desktop review, but it's the way that you analyze the data, your orientation, that makes it quantitative or qualitative. When you start with your proposal, this kind of phrasing, and you will get the slide, so this particular slide is enormously helpful. This kind of phrasing helps you set it all together into your unique research design. You can say the purpose of this study. Now here you fill in quantitative, qualitative, mixed method study. The purpose of this quantitative study is to, here you use your keywords. Understand would be qualitative. Describe can be qualitative. Explain is quantitative. Remember the keywords? The what? What is this phenomenon? The central focus of the study for a particular group or site. This kind of phrasing puts your whole research design into one sentence. Really try and do this for yourself today still, and you will see how the different subsections of your research design fits together. Demonstrate in all aspects of your work an original critical stance and a unique perspective. This is very important. Remember, your research is you. It is your journey. We stand on the shoulders of giants. We look at the work that's gone before, but if we're going to go down this very difficult road of research, we want to contribute something to the world of understanding and knowledge that is unique to us. Let's go back to the idea of upper rationalization of variables. I've already explained the difference between dependent and independent variables. Here's another example. Viewing violence is the independent variable. How much violence are children exposed to in online games, and whether that would lead to more aggressive behavior. It is cause and effect. Then when I look at my variables, I could also look at something called a discrete variable. That doesn't mean that they're polite. A discrete variable means that you only have fixed choices. Okay? It could be, are you a student or a non-student? Are you male or female? That is a discrete kind of variable. Or a continuous variable. What is your age in years, months, dates, and hours? That is something that would continue. It doesn't have a fixed endpoint. Most surveys would have some biographical or demographic data, so that you can at least go and explain what was your sample like? What were these people that you drew in to explain this problem that you wanted to research? And now we come to that very important thing of, when I set up my questionnaire, especially in a quantitative design, I look at the level of measurement of all my variables. Levels of measurements are just, what can this particular variable do? And it's important because the level of measurement will enable you to do certain statistical manipulation of your data, certain statistical tests, and others would not. And they go up in a hierarchy. So if you have nominal data, there are less that you can do with it. The best data is ratio data, but we do not deal a lot with ratio data in the social sciences. So it goes up a continuum, and each one of those will apply that the particular statistical test is appropriate for it. When you set up your questionnaire, try and have a mix of them, of variables on different levels of measurement, and understand what you want to do with each one of them. Now, a nominal variable is the weakest. It is, for example, what is the gender of my respondent, male, female. All it does is it names the different categories. They don't have a particular meaning, it just differentiates. Okay? Now, it's just labeling. Then the next one up is called an ordinal variable. This means that besides labeling, the attributes can be ordered. Typical ordinal ones are my scale variables. Are you satisfied, or very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, dissatisfied, very dissatisfied? That's ordinal kind of measurement. If I want to group students in terms of the year of study that they're in, undergraduate, honors, masters, doctorate, that would be an ordinal kind of variable. Interval means the distances have meaning. In other words, if I've got different age groups, then I can measure the difference in the age groups, and it makes sense. When an ordinal variable, if you say I'm very satisfied with my job, and Tony says I'm very satisfied in my job, I can't say you are both at the same level of being very satisfied. I do not know exactly the differences in it. But if I put you in an age group of the 30s versus an age group like me that's in the 60s, I can go and measure the interval. Ratio means that it has an absolute zero. I'm going to give you another slide to explain these levels of measurements again, because they are important. Let's look at the types of measurement scales. A nominal scale is used to label the variables in different classifications and does not imply a quantitative value or order. It's just A or B. Am I in box A or B? There's no quantitative difference between it. An ordinal scale, see that's why I said there, how satisfied are you with our services? And you can have a very unhappy face and a very happy face. That's an ordinal scale. It's used to represent non-mathematical ideas such as frequency, satisfaction, happiness, the degree of pain, and so on. An interval scale, rate your experience. It's defined as a numerical scale where the order of the variable as well as the difference between the variables are known. And the ratio scale, how many hamburgers can you eat in a day? See, it's a variable measurement scale that not only produces the order of the variable, but also makes the difference between the known variables along with information of the value of the true zero. The true zero has got meaning here. If I say I do eat 0 hamburgers, it means something, as opposed to me not answering the question on gender and get assigned a 0. It doesn't mean that I don't have one. It can mean that I refuse to answer this question, but it doesn't have particular meaning. Let's try these examples for ourselves. What is the level of measurement for the variables in this instrument? This comes directly from a student's questionnaire in a very quantitative survey that they are applying with farm workers in a particular area. What is your gender, male, female? Level of measurement is nominal. Nominal because all we're doing here, even though we give it a 1 and a 2 so that we can enter it into a spreadsheet and analyze it, it has no meaning. I'm just labeling the different levels of my variable gender. What is your age in years? And people could write it down there. A typical interval level measurement. How do you feel about the working conditions on the farm? And here they have a scale, very satisfied, satisfied, neutral, dissatisfied, very dissatisfied, and the different dimensions of the working conditions, the salary, the safety, the working hours, the sick leave, the possibility to learn from others, and people could rate it. Typical ordinal scale. Now for each one of these, let's say I want to go and test whether male and female workers differ on this scale. It means that I can go and look for the statistical test that looks at the interaction between a nominal scale variable and an ordinal scale variable. That is why the level of measurement of your variables are very important. Once you have set up your questionnaire, really go and test it and think very carefully about what is the level of measurement for each one of the variables that I'm testing in my questionnaire, and what is that going to imply for the kinds of statistical tests that I can use when I analyze my data. The favorite ordinal measurements in quantitative designs across many of our disciplines in the social sciences are to come up with scales and indexes. These things often measure attitudes or psychological attributes. Attitudes such as how happy are you with a particular thing, how do you feel about things. Psychological attributes can be something such as resilience, burnout, job satisfaction, ability to stick to your degree and see it through in a minimum time, things like that. The advantages of using a scale and an index at an ordinal level in a quantitative study is that I can go and cover that concept well. Very complex things such as job satisfaction, such as resilience, such as burnout, cannot be measured by one question in your questionnaire. So I can go and cover that concept well if I think scales and indexes. It's often very reliable. There might be existing tests out there that already have been developed. I can go and compare different subgroups. I can compare males and females. I can compare younger and older people. I can compare people of different income groups across their measurement on my scale or index. And it's often quite simple to apply. Can I use an existing scale? Yes, by all means, but you will see when you do your ethical clearances that often if I use an existing scale, I need to go and say, are there any copyrights regarding this issue? Have I received copyright permission to use an existing scale? Is the scale recognized? What are the implications of me using an existing scale? What if I construct my own scale? Yes, you can. Of course you can. But your language must be very clear. The items must test one issue and be short. You must avoid asking about the past or about facts, especially when I'm looking at attitudes. Attitudes are not facts. Attitudes are feelings. And to say to people, how did you feel about green electricity when you were growing up, is a silly kind of question. I'm asking things too far back in the past. People are just not even going to be able to answer it. I must avoid obviously acceptable or unacceptable items. If I go and test job satisfaction, I can't say, how often do you steal from your employer? So, I mean, obviously unacceptable and unacceptable items on any scale or any instrument. It's just silly because people are going to just answer in a particular way. They're going to answer in a way that makes them acceptable to you as a researcher. Avoid the words or, always, no, or exactly. Those are empty signifiers, and they often are exaggerated. Nobody has something all the time or always, or no one ever supports me, or I feel exactly this way. Those are exaggerations. The very typical scale that we use is the Likert scale. Here's an example. Question 63 in a questionnaire was, studying online is as difficult as studying at a contact university. Please tick the number in front of the answer of your choice. Strongly agree, agree, undecided, disagree, strongly disagree. That's a typical Likert scale, typical ordinal level, asking of attitudes amongst a very particular subgroup that I can go and reliably measure and compare groups across my sample, and it's very simple. We also get something called the semantic differential scale. On each line below and between each extreme, place a slash closest to your first impression. How do you feel about the argument that development aid causes dependency? If countries give too much development aid to a developing country, it causes them to become dependent on that aid as opposed to being self-reliant. How do you feel about that? It's correct or it's incorrect, and you go and put your slider towards which one you feel like. It's a shallow argument, it is a strong argument, it is a simple argument, it is a complex argument. That is a semantic differential scale, and then you would go and code what each of these answers mean for your respondents, and you will come up with a scale measurement for each one of these for that particular statement. Now, what makes an index different? An index is made up of various scale type items. So each bit of an index have got a different scale. That through factor analysis, that's a very particular quantitative kind of measurement, would measure a very complex phenomenon. Here's a typical example. It's a pre-existing scale. It is called the sense of coherence index or scale, and it's got 6 items. So each item in this complex index is made up of a scale item. When you talk to people, do you feel that they don't understand you? Is the first one. When you must do something which depends on cooperation with others, do you have the feeling that surely it won't get done, surely it will get done? Think of the people with whom you come into contact daily, aside from the ones to whom you feel closest. How well do you know most of them? All of these make up a psychological attribute called a sense of coherence. It's just an example. It's not, to me, a very good one, but it's just to show you what makes the difference between an index and a scale. An index is just a lot of scale items put together to measure a very complex attribute. More examples of conceptualizations, definitions, and key variables. We go back to that example of factors that influence the early adoption of green electricity by residential users. It was a very quantitative study. The concept was early adoption of a new technology. Can you see it's abstract? How do I make this measurable for my sample of residential users? I made it up out of questions about perceptions of ease of switching from mainstream electricity to solar panels, perceptions of how easy it is to use the new technology, whether people trust in green electricity, and the perception of relative advantages versus relative disadvantages of adopting of this green electricity. The hypothesis was the more users think green power is difficult to acquire and integrate into their daily practices, the lower the probability of adoption will be. So a very clear quantitative one that I could go and measure quantitatively and come to a conclusion. Everything set up before you even hit the streets with your questionnaires. The differences between quantitative and qualitative purpose statements and research questions. Quantitative tend to be more closed. So please be careful. If you say I'm going to do a survey, you can't have all your question items open-ended in your questionnaire, because I want to standardize. I want to be efficient. I want to get the most answers in the quickest possible time. So quantitative questions would be things that ask about probable cause and effect. Why did this happen? Why did you decide to adopt green electricity? Why did you decide to start studying? It uses theory. Why did it happen in view of a particular exponential theory? We assess differences of magnitude. How much did this happen? How many people did this? How many times did it happen? What are the differences amongst groups during what happened? Qualitative, always more open-ended. This one questionnaire, this one interview schedule. Qualitative, open. What happened? Describe it. What was the meaning to people when this happened and as it happened? What happened over time? These things we cannot do so well in a quantitative description. Quantitative is always about explaining or predicting variables, which is why I would always go and cross-tabulate or look at the differences in an attribute according to people's biodemographic variables, whether they're young or old, male or female, a student, non-student, and so on. The independent variable influences the dependent variable. With qualitative, my understanding is exploring the phenomenon, so I never look at cause and effect. It's an in-depth understanding of why and the external forces that are shaped by it. This is a very basic difference between the two orientations. Now, when you start writing your proposal, you've now said quantitative, you use that particular slide that I've given you to say, this is my quantitative study, this is what I want to do. You understand you've got a very fixed design and there are certain decisions that you need to make, and one of the subheadings in your proposal and in your ethical clearance instrument is how are you going to test reliability and validity of this method, of this research design that you've chosen. It often also specifically apply to the instrument that you are going to do, right? So reliability and validity are extremely different in quantitative and qualitative. Please do not apply qualitative measurements on the quantitative or vice versa. I will get to qualitative next week and tell you how we deal with the issues of reliability and validity here. Today we're dealing with quantitative. Do not mix them up. In quantitative, reliability means, do the instruments or the indicators that I've used, you know what indicators are, you know what scale items are, do they produce consistent results? In other words, if I'm asking people's weight, it mustn't all of a sudden, after I get my third respondent, start asking them their age, right? Or their opinion about last week's soccer game. It must reliably always ask them that thing that I want to ask, right? So reliability means that this instrument will always consistently give that particular result. Your watch would always consistently give you results. It does not mean that it is accurate. If your watch is running 10 minutes fast or 10 minutes slower than the actual time, you would reliably get the results, the time, but it's not necessarily accurate. Okay, but reliability looks at stability. In other words, if I measure it now and measure it later, it should still be stable. It should still stably be measuring that thing I wanted to look at, like violent crime. I can go and look at police statistics about violent crime. But can you see that, let's say, the official definition of what counts as violent crime changed over time? I'm going to have a stability problem that will affect my reliability. The same with ill health. If I have a particular definition of ill health now, but I'm measuring it over groups, it must be the same definition. Otherwise, I've got a stability problem and it affects my reliability, food security, and so on. We usually test this with a test-retest statistic. Then we look at internal reliability. This is when you've got a long test or instrument or scale, and we want to make sure that all my sub-items were reliably testing the same thing. For example, that resilience scale that you saw, if you want to look at this, please talk to me, a statistician, somebody who's done any of this before. There are particular statistical methods that you can use to go and test that internal reliability of your instrument. Then if we've got inter-observer or inter-rater consistency, this will affect you most definitely if you are using other research assistants in the field to help you collect your data. Let's say you want to do an enormous survey, and you know I can't get all the data from all my sample in the quickest, most efficient way if I do it on my own. So I'm going to train a few other field observers to help me apply my instrument. Then we've got to make very sure that there's inter-observer or inter-rater consistency. When there are many researchers, sorry, that's a spelling error there, in the team, and observation and categorization is based on a fair amount of subjective judgment. What do I mean? Let's say I've got observers in a classroom, in a teacher's classroom, and I want to observe whether social distancing amongst the pupils are observed at all times in this classroom. Now I've got a whole bunch of people sitting in different classrooms in the school at the same time and noting this down in a very structured way, but it's subjective judgment. I've got to make sure that there is consistency in the way that people have recorded things across my whole thing, because reliability in a quantitative measure depends on all three of those aspects, and you must be able to talk about all three of them in your proposal. How are you going to ensure each one of these? Validity. Validity and reliability goes together. Reliability and validity affect one another. You can't have the one without the other, but the one does not guarantee the others. Like love and marriage, they go together, but neither one are a necessary condition for the other one. So what validity means is, do the instruments or indicators measure what they are supposed to measure? In other words, I'm not using a scale, a bathroom scale, to measure people's age, right? If I use a bathroom scale, then probably what I'm going to look at is the BMI. So would the instrument or the indicator measure what it's supposed to measure? And there are different types of validity. If you're doing a quantitative design, each one of these sub-parts must be populated in your proposal. Face validity is it's intuitive. In other words, let's say you were measuring burnout. You've come up with your own unique scale to measure burnout. Then you at least need to say to your supervisor or to whomever is judging your proposal that at face value, all these scales that you've come up to measure burnout at least fit together. And you would base that face validity on your literature review. In other words, evidence-based writing, these aspects all make up burnout, and it is because the following researchers have found XYZ. Then you get concurrent validity. You look at the different ways to measure the phenomenon. In other words, I've got my scale that looks at job satisfaction, and somewhere down in my questionnaire, I also have a question on absence from work. So from my literature review, I saw that people with poor job satisfaction might be more absent. So the one is a control of the other one. That's concurrent validity in my instrument over my measurements. Predictive validity. If in future the measure will still predict the outcome, in other words, low job satisfaction and leaving the job in the future. So somewhere in my questionnaire, I say, okay, I've measured your job satisfaction, but I'm also going to sneak in a question to ask, are you in the job market? Do you see yourself staying in this company? Are you planning to leave? And you see if these things predict one another. Construct validity, it is deduction from theory. Again, can you see how important your literature review is, evidence-based writing? In other words, here we know that the nature of the job often determines the job satisfaction. Routine jobs usually have less job satisfaction than jobs that provides innovation, own thinking, growth, and change. Convergent validity, using different methods of data collection to confirm. In other words, you can have self-reported items in your questionnaire, but because you are also going into the company where you are measuring the job satisfaction, you can also observe and test or triangulate with another method whether what you have found here in your instrument is valid. Reliability and validity are therefore rigorous in quantitative approaches and follow set guidelines and procedures for establishing these. Typical concerns in a qualitative approach. It is, first of all, whether your measurements are reliable and valid. Make sure that all your bits fit together. Look at what are the measurements for reliability and validity and think critically about that. Always find help from other researchers, from your supervisors, from your literature reviews to make sure, because it's such an investment to go into the field and to apply your instruments, that you want to make sure in quantitative, because we can set all of this up beforehand, that everything is perfect and will help you answer your research questions and meet all your objectives. Then I've got to decide whether I'm looking at causality or just explanation. Now, causality is a very particular thing. Causality, I think, is overrated in the social world. We don't get things fitting together as well. And we would know that from the many different surveys that they often have before election results. And then at the time of the election, we are caught out with surprises in the field. So things are not always as predictable. I think COVID-19 told us all that prediction and causality is important, but is often very problematic in the social world. Causality means where I can, without a shadow of a doubt, say that these particular independent variables or predicted variables led to the result, the outcome. In other words, the fact that my lovely pot plant from Woolies that I always get on Mother's Day was never given any water and was not put in the light, definitely led to the death of this lovely plant. That is causality. Without a shadow of a doubt, this is what caused my outcome. Explanation is a little bit weaker than causality. That is where we say, okay, we can see that these particular variables are related. And that can help us to come up with policy recommendations. We can see that women, for example, in this company experience less job satisfaction than men. And it might be due to their dual roles or because they need to work overtime and they are parents as well. And we can come up with policies that would now help alleviate the problems that causes this outcome. But that is not causality. It doesn't say, man, if you're going to go invest everything into this one particular thing in the company, all your problems would stop. It's not a causal thing. It's more, these things are related. And therefore, we think that if we address the one, the outcome will be different. Remember, it's typical quantification questions of how much, who are affected, how are people differently affected, what are the changes over time, and causes, but not necessarily causality. Causes, we always are cautious with our causes and say we can see that for this particular sample, these things are related and are different in the subgroups, but there could be a whole host of variables that we didn't measure in our study that can also have an influence. In a quantitative approach, we always generalize. In other words, our sample must be able to say that this is probable, it represents our whole population, and therefore what we find in the sample will be true for our entire population. Generalizability is such a strong idea in research that we often go and step into this thing. When we did the most qualitative, experimental, flexible design, remember, generalizability is much more part of the quantitative positivistic and post-positivistic approaches and not such a big deal in qualitative approaches. So don't start mixing our approaches. Remember, there was a road that we decided to follow, and we follow the tools in that one road. We don't mix and match. Replication. The reason why in quantitative approaches we write down our methodology so precisely and we follow our recipe so precisely is that we want to go and replicate it, either because this is our own growth as a scholar. I've come up with a particular South African measurement of burnout that's unique to our circumstances, and I want to measure the scale now, and 10 years down the line I want to go and measure my scale again and see if I can improve it, then replication is important. And that means that I put down very precisely explicit procedures that are standardized. Remember, that was part of our reliability and validity. It's standardized across each observation, each test, each measurement, each question that we ask. It is controlled. There's no bias in it, and subjectivity is minimized. There are precise steps to be followed, and each step in the research design is separate. In a qualitative approach, you will see next week, we often take a step, then we go back. We merge steps. We do interviews, and then we go and transcribe that same evening, and now we decide, okay, I must ask follow-up questions, and we change all the time. Not so in a quantitative approach. Each step needs to be completed before I can take the next one. The research design is set before the research commences, and it is quite rigidly executed. We've spoken a lot about sampling. Sampling is the selection of people or elements that I'm going to observe in my study. And in sampling, in quantitative approaches, we often have what we call probability or random sampling. In other words, we want to make sure that there's some sampling frame and that the population at risk of this particular problem are well represented in my sample. When we talk about a population, it means the total set of units from which I'm going to select certain people or schools or districts from which I'm going to select. The sample is the subset of that population. A sampling frame is some listing from which you would select your sample. In other words, a sampling frame could be a list of students, it could be a list of residents, it could be a list of addresses, it could be a list of employees. And this thing can often cause problems for us in a sampling frame because of confidentiality, because of the POPI Act. We might find it difficult to get sampling frames that are very representative and that would easily be shared with us. So sampling frames are difficult to come by, but in the end, if I want to say that each person that I selected in my sample had an equal chance of being selected, I need to have a frame that at least put those people together and help me to prove that claim that everybody had an equal chance of being selected. Then we have a particular sampling design, that is the method of sampling. Probability, most often for quantitative, non-probability, more for qualitative, although again it is an exaggerated difference, but you would see that often you want to have probability samples if you want to use particular statistics in your quantitative design. A parameter is the characteristic of the population. That is, I found this to be true for my sample, and therefore I say that in terms of my whole population, half of the people in this particular age group are food insecure. A statistic is the characteristic of a sample. Sampling is usually random or probability sampling or random sampling in a quantitative design. When we are studying a very large group of cases, let's say we want to look at all adults in the South African population, it is not possible to obtain observations of all these cases. You need to have an enormous budget and a lot of time if you wanted to have a census of all South African adults to ask them whether they would be vaccinated. So in those cases, we study a sample of the group which represents the larger whole. There is always a risk that the units selected in the sample are somehow exceptional. In other words, the sample does not represent the population. When we get that your sample does not represent your population, we talk about sampling error. Sampling error is reduced by making my sample larger, by looking at my sampling frame, and many other factors. But it's something that you must consider beforehand when you decide on a quantitative study. What is the risk that certain units were not somehow caught up in my sampling, and I therefore have a sample error? We minimize the risk by random sampling. In a random sample, the risk of sampling error can be statistically estimated beforehand. So I can say, because my population is this number, I can work out with a particular formula. And again, you'll need help from somebody with a statistical background. I can work out what my sampling error would be, and this would be acceptable for me to live with. With a random and a representative sample, we can, with a definite level of confidence, generalize from the sample to the population. We can say with 99% accuracy, with 95% accuracy, we have found this to be true for our sample, and therefore it would be true for my whole population, which for this example was the complete SA adult population. Let's look at something that is done on a regular basis for the whole SA adult population. Something like HIV testing can be done. A sampling error that often occurs there is that a lot of our data for HIV positive detection is often based on testing of pregnant women, mothers to be, on their blood tests. Can you see we can introduce a sampling error there because we're actually not testing each and every SA adult member. So these are the things to consider in a quantitative design. We want to make sure that our sample is as representative, we want to reduce sampling error, and we've got to think of the things that will introduce that sampling error. Sampling techniques and sampling methods. You always have to say the type of sampling technique that you've chosen, the reasons for your choice, the planned sample size. You need to set out saying I'm going to have this particular sample size, and I can justify my sample size that I'm going for. And then you have got the realized sample size. And these two things are not often the same. I can set out to say I wanted to sample 1,000 people in this particular residential area. And then I find out that I had a lot of refusals. And now I end up with 90 instead of 1,000. Can you see there can be a problem here? This is where the conversation with your study leader, your supervisor, fellow researchers are important. When you start executing your planned sample and things go wrong in the field, what are we going to do? Are we going to replace? Are we starting to sampling anew? Because everything is planned beforehand in a quantitative study and must be precisely executed. So we've got to be very sure of those two and the difference between the two. I can't, with a thesis, say I was planning a random sample of 2,000 people, and in the end I'm writing up the results of just 100. No examiner would want to pass that because you had an enormous sampling problem. You've got to explain how it was done, what are the particular inclusion and exclusion criteria to include somebody in your sample. If I wanted to go and test the perceptions of water security in a particular location, a particular area where people stay, could I include all the adult members? Did I exclude people who just recently moved into the area and might not have experienced cyclical water shortages? That kind of decision. I've got to explain any sampling inadequacies. What is my sampling frame like? What are the budgetary and time constraints on my sample? Types of random samples that I would use in quantitative studies, and I'm not going to go to each one in detail. I'm making you aware of them so that you can go and read up more on each one of them. And I've got a list of possible sources where you can go at the end of these slides. You get simple random sampling. That's where you've got a very specific list of people, let's say people in an office, and you put their names in a box. You write down their names, you put it in a box, you shuffle it all together, and you start pulling names from a box. That's simple random sampling. It's very easy with a smaller population or a smaller sampling frame. Stratified means that you think that there are differences in your sample according to certain hierarchies. In other words, you can stratify job satisfaction measurement in a particular workplace according to job rank. You get systematic sampling, which is another form of having subgroups in your sample that you're going to do. Multi-stage, this is typically the one that the quantitative students will do, is a multi-stage sample. Let's say what the student wanted to do was to look at nurses at all hospitals in Gauteng. She decided to select 2,000 of them, and then she had to do it in stages. She selected certain hospitals, she selected them by certain age groups, she selected them by type of specialization, and so on. This is typically what students do. You go and perhaps say, okay, I want to look at this particular region in Ethiopia, so I'm looking at these particular kabeles, and then I'm going to choose so many households from each area, and so on. So there are stages in the selections. Clusters are where you've got a specific neighborhoods. You cluster them according to income groups, and you're going to see, can I go and do a few interviews in the lower income group and in the higher income group, and so on. Multi-phase is like stages, but instead of different subgroups, you now look at different times in the interviews. It is like multi-stage, but each sample is studied before moving on to the next. In other words, you can start with households, then you've got a separate smaller sample of mothers with children under 5, and you've got an even smaller sample of working mothers. This is typically used in large questionnaires such as the demographic and health surveys that are done by Stats SA, where they've got one big household survey to look at demographic characteristics and the health trends in the household, but there's a smaller little sub questionnaire that is only applicable to a smaller sample of mothers with young children, and then from that even a smaller sub little questionnaire that is intended for mothers who are working and might experience certain issues regarding childcare. Area sampling is another type of multi-stage one. It's often very popular with students, where they start selecting cities and suburbs, then select streets within the suburb, you select households within that street, and you select heads of households from that again. In other words, you go to the household, and if it is the 10-year-old answering the door, you say, no, I want to speak to an adult member of the household. For area sampling, your sampling frame can be a map, because it lists all of these subsections, and there's your sampling frame. Spatial sampling is another one. This is more done for temporary congregations of people, where you say, okay, I go and sample people who attended a particular church service or people who've attended a graduation, and I'm sampling it over time. Data generation in quantitative approaches, experiments are used. Experiments, don't just think of lab circumstances. There are something called field experiments, which are, for example, where you go and observe how people collect water in a particular area, and it's very quantitative measurement. Questionnaires is the more typical one. Questionnaires that you set up. Remember what I said about structuring, about open-ended and closed-ended questions. Surveys, use questionnaires. Structured interviews, structured observation, document analysis that is quantitatively analyzed. I gave you an example earlier this morning. Unobtrusive measures, this is things such as observing people's behavior in a particular institution, but doing it in a very covert way. The type of information you wish to collect will determine the type of question style that is suitable. Open and closed formats. An open format, respondent can formulate their own answer. For example, what are the main sources of stress in your life? That is a typical open-ended question. Closed format, I've got very fixed categories that you go and click on the answer. Gender, male, female, how do you feel about this particular issue? I'm satisfied, dissatisfied, and the person can go and click or mark a particular answer category. As I said, in quantitative, we tend to have more closed format than open format ones. It does not mean that if I've got a questionnaire with a lot of open-ended questions, I now have a qualitative study. Does not mean that. A qualitative study means that it's a different orientation to the data gathering altogether. So please be careful of the words that you use, the nomenclature that you use. A questionnaire is a quantitative standardized instrument that I apply in a survey. It has some open format questions, but mostly closed format or fixed category answers. And if I'm going to do this online or virtually or an emailed questionnaire, the more closed categories I have, the better it is to collect a lot of data efficiently in a small number of days. So remember, everything fits tightly together in quantitative. A word on surveys. Questionnaire construction is very important. I think we get so caught up in writing a perfect proposal. One of my students said, who just recently completed the last chapter in his thesis, said to me, you know what, Prof, if I knew everything I knew now, my proposal would have been so easy to write. And I think we all feel like that. That proposal is a scary thing. We get very caught up into it because we're planning everything on paper and everything is new and we're at the start of our journey. So we get caught up in writing the perfect proposal. We get caught up in writing the perfect documents for our ethical clearance, and then that questionnaire construction gets left behind. Please remember that when we're doing quantitative, we plan all of these things beforehand. Start thinking about your questionnaire construction even now, even at the very formative stages of your proposal, and think of it very carefully and spend time testing it. Ask your friends to complete your questionnaire. Look at all the elements, see if you test all your objectives. And this construction is even more so if it's emailed or online. At UNISA as staff, I think we can all say we get a lot of emailed questionnaires, and there's nothing more frustrating than if you're starting that emailed questionnaire and the options do not work or the questions are unclear. So really spend a lot of time on questionnaire construction. It should be preempted by informed consent negotiation. This is always necessary, even in your questionnaire. There must be informed consent somewhere. Pay attention to format and question wording. We write at a very high level when we write proposals and research reports and masters and doctorate things. We write for our colleagues and we write for other scientists. So we use very lofty wording. Please, if it's just ordinary people who do not understand half of the words we use, make sure that the question wording is simple and clear to understand. Do the necessary translations into the nomenclature, into the vernacular, into the language of the people that we're doing the research with. Remember that all categories, it is the answer options at the questions, must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. What does that mean? This is a typical mistake that is made in questionnaires. It was a question that says, tick your age category. And the categories were age under 21 years, 21 to 40 years, 40 to 50 years, 50 years and older. Now, if I'm 21, I can tick it here or in the next one. Not so. If I'm 40, I can be here and there. If I'm 50, I can tick this category and that category. So make very sure that your categories are mutually exclusive so that we don't frustrate people and they make mistakes in your questionnaire. Each question must be relevant. Each question must have clarity, simplicity. Look at the language use. Guys, this is very, very important. Do not include questions that are irrelevant, because what do we want to do with an instrument in a quantitative thing? We want to get efficiency, the best answers to meet our objectives in the shortest space of time. Beware of sensitive questions. This is where you will pick up problems in ethical clearance review. Make sure that your questions are not sensitive. Deliver on what you promise. Test your instrument. In other words, this delivering on your promise. If you say to, if somebody says to me, your responses are completely anonymous, but the very first question is, what is your staff number? It means that they're not delivering on what they promised. They said I'm anonymous, but you've got my staff number. So think of those things. Test the instrument. Test and test and test. Think of the level of measurement of each variable. You know we've done level of measurement quite a bit now. And think that the level of measurement, I must aim for the highest level of measurement if I can. I must think of what are the statistical tests that I will do, which ones would be excluded from me if my level of measurement is not right. How does it link to my objectives? Think of the types of analysis you want to do. Non-response is a big concern because it's going to introduce sampling error. Even if I get all 1,000 people to answer my questionnaire, if certain questions become too sensitive and people just skip that question, I still have non-response. That is still affecting the reliability and the validity of my instrument, because some of my items were not answered by more than half of my sample. So that must be a concern as well. Many popular tools are used for conducting online surveys. They include things such as SurveyMonkey, Boomerang, Survey Gizmo, Checkbox, Lime Survey, Google Forms. I've tried myself. I find them a bit limiting. Each one has its strengths and weaknesses. I would suggest, if you want to use these online surveys to develop your instrument, is that you go and look at each one of them, try them out. Data collection methods and fieldwork. In quantitative, we've got structured questionnaires. It means it stays the same for each observation, for each respondent. It's the same. More open-ended in questionnaires, more fixed items than open-ended in structured questionnaires. We can have experiments, we can have surveys, we can have secondary data analysis of existing data. Do not exclude existing data, even if you're doing the most qualitative of all studies. When you describe the background to your problem, still go and do existing data. Look at census data, look at data from Stats SA, regular household surveys that exist already to describe your problems. Always give a reason for your choice. And that reason is always twofold. Every methodological decision that I write into my proposal or my eventual report, I've got to give the evidence for. I chose to do my sampling like this because, that because always is twofold. Because of what I found in literature, number one, because it relates back to my objectives, to my goals, to what I wanted to achieve in my study. Twofold always. This is so important. Evidence-based writing, giving a compelling story. Always have those things at the back of your mind whatever you write. Describe the instrument, describe the time, place, the duration, the context, and the language of data generation. How it was recorded and kept, and the ethical considerations. If I promise anonymity, I've got to sustain that. If I promise confidentiality, I've got to sustain that. If I promise it will take you an hour to complete my questionnaire, you must deliver on your promises. I'm not going to go through this one because we're going to run out of time. I'm hurrying towards the end. The data analysis strategies and quantitative designs. UNISA gives us access to SPSS. I think there are further courses in this here that you will be informed of. It is a lovely program to be able to use. There are lots of online support for it, and there are lots of people who will be able to assist you with it. If you're doing a smaller quantitative study, you can always do it on an Excel spreadsheet. It can still do some of the basic statistics for you. Always think of your data presentation. Start with your biodemographic descriptions, because we always want to tell our reader who were the people in our sample. So always start with that. Tables, we must have tables in quantitative designs. Please, please, please don't put tables in qualitative studies. Tables have got this space in a quantitative study. A table always have a number. Those numbering conventions can change according to in which department you work or for which publication you are going with your article or whatever. Usually it would be a number such as table 1.1, table 2.1, according to the particular chapter that you are. Make sure of those numbering conventions, but each table does have a number. Each table has got a title that's clear, simple, and accurate. And each table must have the number of cases. How many people did this particular table apply to? And always must indicate the type of statistics that appear in that table. Is it head counts? Is it numbers? Is it a percentage? Is it a percentage distribution? Is it a mean? What is the statistic that's being depicted in the table? Graphs are different from tables. Graphs are depictions. A graph must always also have a number and a title. And please try and make your reading exciting in your quantitative study. If you've got a table, loads of table, turn some of them into graphs. Don't have the same graph everywhere. Writing a whole thesis with pie charts is very, very trying on the person who need to read all those pie charts. So also be aware that the level of measurement of your variable will allow you to do a certain graph. So I can have a line graph for any continuous ratio or interval variable, for example, your BMI or your heart rate. That can be a line graph. Histograms are more for ratio data, bar graphs for ordinals. You get pie charts for proportions, and you get scattergrams. Now, you can go and read up on each one of these, and please be very certain that your level of measurement for your variables suits your graph, and do try and change them up a little bit in your work to make the reading exciting. A table and a graph never speaks for itself. So if I've got a table in it, and I've given it a very clear title, and I've given the number of cases, I mustn't go and expect of my reader to go and interpret my table for themselves. I've measured job satisfaction. Here it is. This is how it differed according to the genders and the age groups. There we are. Read it for yourself. It's not what our writing at this level is about. You go and describe the main trends in your table. And the same with a graph. They do not speak for themselves. You need to tell the reader what you see in this depiction of your data. Inferential statistics, that is beyond the basics that I show now. And mostly when you do quantitative, you want to get to inferential statistics. That's where you start using your SPSS. And you look for association between variables. There you can get simple correlation coefficients. We're not doing statistics today. Be aware of them. And once again, see the type of statistic that you can do is again dependent on the measurement level of your variable. Okay, I've listed some of them here, but you've got to be aware. If you want to say, in the end, I want to go and test the correlation between variables, make sure that you've discussed it with other people. What are the levels of measurement that my variables must be at if I want to do this? Which tests would I do? What are the requirements of the data for that tests? Then you get tests of significance, that is chi-squares and others, but there are endless possibilities nowadays. New techniques are come to the fore each time. If you are at the level of a doctorate and you also want to write articles from that, which is nowadays a requirement, and you are targeting specific journals, do read that journal as often as you can. Get that table of contents. Look at the types of statistics that speaks to your topic, and make sure that your own research fits into that. Otherwise, people will not be interested in reading your work. I'm now going to go to the strengths of a quantitative design. I've said that often in our proposals we need to justify why we've chosen a particular path to go down to answer our questions and to find answers to our research objectives. So here are things that I can write about. Why did I choose a quantitative design? First of all, it enables the research and the description of social structures and processes that are not directly observable. We've spoken about job satisfaction quite a bit. We've spoken about adoption of green energy. We've spoken about water scarcity and food insecurity. Those are big societal phenomena that are not directly observable. We know they're there, but a quantitative design can go and help us to describe that, to depict that, to show what are the dimensions of this and how many people are affected. It is well suited for quantitative description and comparisons between groups, comparisons between areas. You can describe change. We've spoken about the change in violent crime, for example, the incidence of it. We can go and describe it over time. Has it improved? Has it not improved? It enables us to explain things. And I've spoken to you about causality, that it's often not very possible in the social science, but at least we can say that things are dependent on certain variables to be present, and therefore we can target in our policy intervention certain interventions so that this phenomenon can somehow be alleviated. So these are the strengths, how I can go and justify why I chose the quantitative path. What are the limitations? You know, in most of our proposals, we say there are limitations to my choices, and the limitations speak to the particular methodological road that you chose to answer your question. And here are the things that you can consider when you write about the limitations of your choices. Any quantification would simplify or compress the complex reality. We know that job satisfaction can be more than all the items that we've included, but we compress it, we simplify it, because we've got a particular goal in mind. It is abstract, it is a constrained perspective, therefore. It is only applicable for measurable things. I can't go and quantify your dreams. I think I'm running out of time. I'm going to finish quickly. It presumes an extensive knowledge. It is difficult to static processes or dynamic phenomenon. There is a static view. The description of the actor's perspective is often not possible because we have a lot of closed option questions in there. It sets forth a spurious sense, a false sense of accuracy because it is measured. This we often find in some of our high-level journals that they say, if you're not quantified, it's not good work. But that's a spurious sense of accuracy. There's always bias. We've got to guard against it. Often our instrumentation takes over and it can become a barrier between the researcher and respondent. I'm not going to go too much into that. If you've got questions, you can always email me afterwards. I want to tell you that currently we have a post-foundationalist understanding of paradigms. In other words, we no longer just take crude positivism as being acceptable, and therefore in our limitations we would also talk about what is the limitations of big data, how data extraction can be problematized, how we can have ways of including even in the most rigid of structured interviews, people in perhaps asking a few more open-ended questions and perhaps testing our questionnaires through a qualitative methods first, having other people come into that space and talk about the questions that we ask. I'm rushing towards the end, people. Always look, these are questions that you can go and ask yourself when you look at your design, but the last one is, the last two are the most important. There must be a design between, a match between your research design and your objectives, and there must be a clear and complete description of your design. Common problems that occur is that if you've got a lack of focus, where you don't know what is your central research question, and you cannot say to others why you have chosen a particular path for your methodology. If there's a lack of coherence, don't start mixing and matching quantitative and qualitative. If you've done too little literature research, if your research design is ill-conceived, always make sure that you can give raw data. Don't just give your highfalutin statistics at the end. Always give descriptive data as well. Here are a few references that you can go and look at. Very good. The things that I've referenced in my slides, as well as further reading that are available in the library for you to look at. These are exceptionally good general introduction research books. And then of course there's the SAGE Methods Plus, that is a wonderful tab in your wonderful library access at UNISA. We are very blessed to have a wonderful library at UNISA that gives us access to this particular site that has got very clear examples, videos, and case studies of how other people have used these methods that we can learn from. And then, because I've run over time, I can just thank you for your participation